Hello students, today we will focus on the evolution of humans and answer the old question of how did we get here. Humans are classified like any other species under a species name according to Linnaean taxonomy, and that species name for us is Homo sapiens. But like any other organism, and now that you're familiar with taxonomic rankings, what I'm showing you here is a table that tells you the entire classification of human beings. And one that I want to point out, one of these classifications, is this one here. There is a subfamily that includes hominins, which are a type of primate group separated from all other apes. This means that we belong to a larger group, but the group that contains humans is unique enough to be classified as a subfamily. This is relevant because we already talked about some previous concepts that in modern taxonomy sometimes diversity is so high in a group or some particular species are so unique that you may need to sort of add different ranks that are in between. So we use terms like supra or sub when that is the case, and humans are an example of this. So we are part of the kingdom Animalia because we are classified as animals. And we are chordates in the phylum Chordata because we have a backbone. We are considered mammals, and that classifies us under a class called Mammalia, and there are a number of characteristics here. We will talk about these in a little bit more detail because this is not completely accurate here, although it includes some of those synapomorphies of all mammals. And we belong to an order that includes primates. Our family would be the Hominidae, but then there is a subfamily that includes humans. And of course, I already told you the genus and specific epithet here, so our species is Homo sapiens, belonging to the group that we know as hominins, which is a subfamily. What are the characteristics that make mammals what they are? If we're going to talk about humans, then we need to talk about the larger groups that we belong to. And the purpose of this particular lecture is to guide you through the changes that have happened and the history that led us to evolve as what we are right now. We are mammals because we have 3 bones in our ear. Our lower jaw is comprised of only 1 bone as opposed to 2 bones, which is what you find in other groups of chordates. We produce milk as mammals that is fed to the young, and that one is an interesting one, as you will see when it comes to humans in particular, because we are the only species that actually drinks milk as adults. We have body hair and fur because we are mammals, and we have a heart that contains 4 chambers. Now, all these are characteristics that bind together all mammals. These are what we call synapomorphies, and that's a term that I've used before. But that means that in addition to these, we have other characteristics that separate us from other mammals that would group us in a more defined, in a smaller subclassification of the Mammalia. So to repeat, these characteristics that I'm showing you here are characteristics that all mammals have in common and that separate mammals from other groups of animals with backbones. There is a number of other characteristics that are often thrown around that many mammals have, but they're not completely unique. Some of these may be a surprise to you because we tend to think of mammals as individuals that give birth to live young, but in fact that is not completely true. There is a group of mammals called the monotremes that is a very primitive group, what we call a basal group, that in fact lay eggs. And there's 5 species of those that are still alive. There's a good fossil record on them. 2 of the most commonly seen ones are the ones that I'm showing you here, the platypus and the echidna, both from Australia. These monotremes have other characteristics in common with mammals and are classified under the mammalians because of those. But we cannot use that giving birth to live young character as a way of defining mammals as a whole, because most of them may do this, but not all. And that's what I'm getting at with this slide, is that when you look on the internet, for example, for characteristics of mammals, many of these traits that I'm showing you here will come up, but in reality, there are exceptions to these. When we're doing phylogenetics, we need to look for synapomorphies to make these groupings, and those should be characteristics that are common to all individuals within that group. Another one that you often find if you do these kinds of searches for traits of mammals is that mammals tend to have differentiated dentition, so they have different types of teeth. Well, the fact is this is not unique to mammals. Some types of lizards have the same. They have different types of teeth that have different functions. Another one that is commonly seen, that teeth fall off and then they are replaced once. There are animals like sharks that lose teeth constantly and they get their teeth constantly replaced. So that's not a problem. But not all mammals do this one-time tooth replacement. Elephants and kangaroos are two exceptions, and there are more. So these two animals do not undergo this process. Another one that is commonly seen, the old term here is warm-blooded, but that is not an accurate term. The right scientific term for that is endothermy, and these are animals that control their own temperature. So they maintain their body temperature within very small defined limits. Well, yes, all mammals have this, but so do birds. And birds, as you already know, evolved from dinosaurs. So this is a trait that has evolved in two completely different lineages of vertebrate animals. The next one that you often see referred to is the presence of a diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscular organ that sits basically at the base of your lungs and separates your lungs from the rest of the organs in the abdominal cavity, namely the rest of the digestive system, your intestines, and so forth and so on. Well, the fact is that yes, the diaphragm of mammals is more sophisticated than that found in other groups, but birds and reptiles also have a diaphragm, so that is not really a unique trait. Another one that you see, the complex brain functions that you observe in mammals. Most of this comes from the fact that mammals tend to show very complex behavior, but so do birds. And again, birds come from a reptile lineage, an ancient lineage that led to the evolution of dinosaurs, and one group of dinosaurs became birds. The fact is, some birds, like parrots and crows, have been shown to be highly intelligent. It has been calculated that a crow has intelligence of a 7-year-old human. They have social behaviors, they learn from one another, they can teach each other things, and they have problem-solving abilities. So when we think of complex brain functions, we need to think beyond our ability to be self-aware as humans, because we're talking about mammals in general. Mammals evolved from a lineage of reptiles, but those reptiles are not related to dinosaurs. So the fossil record tells us a pretty good story, a pretty well-defined story about where mammals came from by stitching together just thousands and thousands of different life forms that are no longer with us and went extinct. But in combination to the fossil record, we have used morphological studies of current and extinct species, and we have used also molecular evidence, the evolution of certain genes, to put together this history that led to the formation of mammals. And the current hypothesis is that a group of tetrapods, animals with 4 legs, and this includes amphibians, it includes reptiles, it includes mammals, those evolved from fishes, a particular group of fishes called lobe-finned fishes. That was one of the major evolutionary steps towards colonizing land, and this is something that we've talked about before. But one of these groups that evolved from these lobe-finned fishes and became tetrapods started changing and adapting and led to the evolution of the earliest mammals. Those earliest mammals came from a reptile group that were what we call reptile-like tetrapods, and they are called synapsids. The synapsids then became the lineage that led to the evolution of mammals, and that's shown here in this phylogeny. So the early tetrapods that came from fish, so the fishes should be somewhere in an even basal line down here, led to two main lineages. One that led to the reptiles. Some of these became dinosaurs, others became snakes, others became turtles, others became birds. And then a second lineage that became the synapsids. The synapsids went through several changes. Some of them became other groups that I am not paying much attention here because that would be too complicated. But one group led to larger, more sophisticated, bigger synapsids. The most celebrated of them is the Dimetrodon, because it has made for a very famous fossil. Dimetrodon skeletons have been found almost in completion, and one of the characteristics that stands out when you look at them is that they have this sail on top of their body. Now, many people confuse animals that look like this, and they are lizard-like, with dinosaurs, but the fact is Dimetrodons and synapsids were not dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are a separate lineage. If you're wondering what the function of this is, of course there are many theories about it, but most scientists tend to agree that this was used for thermal regulation, for regulation of temperature, because microscopic studies of fossils have shown that the bones around here have a lot of different holes, and those holes are interpreted as having had blood vessels, as having had arteries and veins in them. So blood probably flowed through this, and it was a way of exchanging and releasing heat with the surrounding environment, very much like the ears of elephants or the ears of many desert species that are very long and very flat. But going back to mammals, you can see that the other lineage here went through a number of evolutionary changes until eventually one of these groups radiated into one group of mammal-like organisms, and then another lineage that became modern mammals. So this is a different type of organism here, or group of organisms I should say, the cynodonts, than true mammals are. We don't have any representatives of these alive, but we have a fairly good fossil record of them. As you can see, one of the changes that happened through time is that synapsids began very reptile-like and very small, and over millions and millions of years they became larger and more complex and more mammal-like. If you can see these forms here, they begin getting a little bit stockier and a little bit more mammal-like. But these are not, I emphasize again, not dinosaurs. These are a separate evolutionary lineage that led to modern mammals. Modern mammals, in turn, radiated into three main clades, three main lineages. The monotremes that we already talked about, which lay eggs, and two other groups, one that is called the marsupials and the other one that is called the placentals. The marsupials are mostly found in Australia, but there are representatives in other continents, including the Americas. In the case of the marsupials, the fetus, it develops outside of the female's body in a pouch called a marsupium. Placentals, on the other hand, develop their babies inside the female's body, inside a structure called the uterus, which is an organ for bearing young. You can tell which one humans belong to. We evolved from a lineage of the mammals that evolved to become the placental mammals. Within these, of course, many groups again underwent adaptive radiation over millions of years, and one of the groups that became more advanced in terms of certain structures, particularly for grasping, is the order that contains monkeys, apes, and other less well-known groups like lemurs and tarsiers, and that is the primates. There are three main groups again of living primates: the lemurs, lorises, and podos, and I'm showing you a picture of a lemur here. There are a number of species here, mostly from New Zealand. And then there's the tarsiers, which we will not talk about, but you're free to do some research on these guys. They're quite unique looking animals. And then the anthropoids. The anthropoids are the ones that we're most familiar with and include monkeys and apes. Again, we're trying to trace the evolutionary history of humans, so I emphasize one more time, humans belong to one of these groups, one of the subgroups here, which is the group that apes belong to. But still, more subdivisions are to come. Primates have a number of shared characters, a number of synapomorphies, and these include having hands and feet that are designed for grabbing and grasping things. They tend to have larger brains than most other mammals. They also tend to have shorter jaws. If you think that the jaws of certain primates are fairly long, compare that to that of reptiles. For example, think of a crocodile. We have also a very important adaptation in this group, which is that the eyes are not on the sides of the head, but rather they point forward. And what that does is it gives the organism depth perception. So we have what it's called binocular vision. The eyes are pointed forward, and we can tell how far things are from our vantage point. The primates also show fairly complex social behavior. They have parental care, so the adults take care of the young for a while. And there is an opposable thumb that is part of the devices that evolved that allowed these groups of organisms to grab things with their hands. So the opposable thumb is a fairly important one because, among other things, it allowed for better manipulation of materials, including tools. Monkeys and apes have true opposable thumbs. We have an ancestral primate here, one lineage that leads to the lemurs and lorises, another one that leads to two groups, the tarsiers that we didn't talk about much, and then the anthropoids. As you can see down here, we are part of the anthropoids. We're down here. What I'd like to emphasize with this particular figure, this phylogeny, is that the common misconception that we evolved from monkeys is way off, because as you can see, the same ancestor that led to tarsiers also led to a second lineage, and that in turn split into what we call the New World monkeys and the Old World monkeys, which are the ones in the Americas here, and the ones in the Old World, meaning mostly Africa and Eurasia. Now, this in turn, as you can see, underwent a number of new adaptive radiations, and we're down here. So that means that a number of evolutionary changes happened after the evolution of monkeys that led to new species groups, and from those even more subdivisions, and then eventually a tiny fraction of those has a common ancestor with humans. And what we're trying to do is to trace and piece together this history. And even humans as such have their own complexity, as we will see. So the first monkeys evolved in the Old World, mostly in Africa, but also Asia. And a second group evolved about 25 million years ago in mostly South America. So these are the New World monkeys. New and Old World monkeys underwent separate radiations independent from each other. So this is a classical example, again, of a concept that we talked about before called allopatric speciation. From the Old World monkeys, recalling again that phylogeny that I just showed you, within the anthropoids, one lineage that evolved from an ancestor in common with the Old World monkeys became the apes. And the apes radiated again into other groups. The apes comprised things like gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and of course, we're in this subgroup. So we are part of this larger category. This happened somewhere around 20 to 25 million years ago. The species Homo sapiens itself is only about 200,000 years old. So the first remains that we know of modern humans are about 200,000 years old tops, which means that we haven't been around for a very long time, considering that the evolution of life on Earth dates for a lot longer than that, in terms of billions of years. There is a subfield of science, of biology, called paleoanthropology, that devotes itself exclusively to the study of human origins. This is the group responsible for the new subdivision, or newer subdivision, I should say, of hominins as a subfamily of the hominids. The hominins are more closely related to humans than they are to chimpanzees. And the reason why we now have a subfamily is because we have unearthed more fossils that indicate that there has been more than one species of humans in the history of the world. In fact, about 20 species of humans are now known. So we have at least 20 species of hominins for which we have found fossils that have been confirmed by different groups of scientists. And what I'm showing you here is a timeline for the existence and the span of some of these species. Not all of them are here. There are a couple more that are not in this graph, but you can see that some of these overlapped. So if one of these bars overlaps with the other one within the time span, that means that those two species occur on Earth at the same time. And in fact, you see that modern humans are here, Homo sapiens, but Neanderthals were also around at the same time. And it is possible that Homo erectus was as well. That's still being debated. Hominins originated in Africa, so we all come from Africa somewhere around 6 to 7 million years ago. Early hominins did not have the brain capacity that modern humans do, but they probably walked upright at least part of the time. By now we have enough evidence from fossil skeletons to show that the position of the hips in relation to the position of the backbone indicates a species that walks upright. We also have been able to measure the volume inside the skull of some of these fossil remains, and we know that the cranial capacity, that's the volume of headspace in your head, was a lot smaller, so that indicates a smaller brain. I keep coming back to misconceptions because there's too many of those out there and too many confused people that tend to think of evolution as some kind of heresy because they don't understand the science behind it and the fact that scientists did not come up with this stuff. But a lot of this has to do with what they don't understand. So again, another set of misconceptions is that when you think of humans, we have a common ancestor, and in fact we share 98% of our genetic makeup with chimpanzees, but we did not evolve from chimpanzees. There's not a direct evolutionary line. We have a common ancestor, and the common ancestor populations, some of them turn into chimpanzees and the others turn into human-like hominids. The other mistake, and this is a more recent thing, for a long time scientists believed that there had been different species of humans, but it was mostly in a linear fashion. So one species of human became extinct because those populations evolved into another species, and those in turn evolved into yet another species. That we know now is not the case. When it comes to humans, we are no different in our evolutionary history than most other species. There were more than one species of humans that radiated from the same primitive ancestral species of human, and that ancestral species radiated into more than one species over time. So think of human evolution as a tree rather than a ladder in which one species turn into another, into another, into another, until here we are. So the first group of true humans are what we call the Australopiths, or Australopithecines, which are a group of hominins that began somewhere around 4 to 2 million years ago, and some of these species walk fully erect all the time. These are the first group to show evidence of tool use, but this evidence is indirect. What we have found is that along with the bones of these early human-like mammals, there were also mammal bones from those early mammals that they probably utilized that have marks on their bones that show that they were done artificially with some kind of cutting tool. Those first marks are about 2.5 million years old. So these initial humans at least could defend themselves from animals by using tools. We do not know if they were active hunters of these animals. The record is fuzzy at best on that one. What we do know, however, is that about 2 million years ago, somewhere around 1.9 million years ago, hominins began to walk for long distances. They began to move away from the areas that they originally evolved from their ancestral lands. And they did this on two legs because we have fossilized tracks, we have fossilized footprints that demonstrate that this was the case. The earliest fossils of the genus Homo, to which we belong, were those of what we now know as the species Homo habilis. And Homo habilis lived somewhere between 2.4 to 1.6 million years, so these were probably the ones that made those footprints. The Homo habilis etymology means handy man. So this is the first species for which we have found fossil tools. The previous case, we found indirect evidence of tool use because of cuttings in the bones of animals. For Homo habilis, we know that they were capable of constructing tools because we have found them among their remains. Ergaster came later. Homo ergaster was completely bipedal, meaning it only walked all the time on two legs, and it had a larger brain capacity than earlier hominids or hominins in this group. Remember again that hominins are a subgroup of the hominids, so that statement is correct. This species came about somewhere between 1.9 and 1.5 million years ago, and it was the first group that started showing a reduction of the size differences between the sexes, which is something that we observe in earlier species of humans and in, of course, other apes. This is what we call sexual dimorphism, and this is a concept that again goes back to previous classes on evolution. Homo ergaster fossils are now classified as a separate species, but for a long time there was a lot of debate among scientists of whether they belong to another species called Homo erectus. Now we recognize them as a separate species because now we have more fossils of both groups. Homo erectus is significant because this is the one that moves completely away from Africa and moves into other continents. This happened through land bridges, and particularly in areas where the polar ice caps were very, very large, which in turn means that the sea levels were a lot lower. That means that a lot of land masses were connected by land over areas that we call land bridges that are now submerged because the sea is a lot higher at this point. Once away from Africa, some groups of Homo erectus, some populations began evolving and adapting to their local conditions, and that's what led to the evolution of Neanderthals. Homo neanderthalensis is exclusively a European species and Near East species that dates from 200,000 to 28,000 years ago, more or less. These had thicker bones, they had larger brain capacity, and we know because of findings that they buried their dead. It's important to point out that burying their dead is not a sign of any kind of mythological belief. Burying their dead could have easily been a self-preservation mechanism because you can imagine that if you leave a corpse laying around, there will be very large animals that will come and try to scavenge on it. So this could have easily been just a mechanism of avoiding encounters with bears and other very large mammals that were around in the area, like saber-toothed tigers. They also made hunting tools that we can match to markings on fossilized remains of animals, and the bones of the animals have been found nearby the bones of some of these early humans. So we now can say with a good degree of certainty that Neanderthals were in fact hunters. Homo sapiens, which is the species that we belong to, is a little bit more recent, but not by a lot. The first fossils of actual Homo sapiens date to about 195,000 years ago. These are what all living humans descended from. These were found originally in Africa, but of course you know that they also radiated at one point or another, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. The oldest fossils of Homo sapiens from outside Africa have been dated to about 115,000 years old, and they were found in the Middle East. So that means that it took several tens of thousands of years for Homo sapiens to move out of Africa and into other regions. And we're talking about quite a big span of time, even though if this is a blink of an eye in terms of geological time, which is written in terms of billions of years. The first humans that arrived into the Americas, into a new world, did that somewhere around 15,000 years ago. And again, this was a period in which sea levels were a lot lower. Most scholars believe that these humans crossed from the tip of Russia into Alaska through what is now known as the Bering Strait. But the Bering Strait at that point, because sea level was so low, was probably connected through a land bridge, as I mentioned before. This is only a snapshot of what we have so far, but that doesn't mean that the history of human evolution is already pieced together. More recent discoveries have painted an even more complicated and more fascinating picture of how we came to be than we previously thought. For example, in 2004, a number of fossils were found in a cave in Indonesia of a very small hominin, and these remains were only 18,000 years old. So scientists at the beginning thought that what they were looking at were a couple of skeletons of abnormally developed individuals because they were smaller in size. They didn't think for a second that these could actually be a separate species. It took several years for people to study these in detail and come up with a consensus that in fact these were representatives of yet an unknown species of humans, which is now known as Homo floresiensis, and it was probably around, at least in this very small area of the world, at the same time that Homo sapiens was found in other places. It's even more interesting when you think about the fact that now we have the technology to extract ancient DNA. This is of course done when you have remains of a very special type that have been preserved under circumstances that some of the molecules of DNA actually survived the fossilization process. In 2014, scientists published for the first time the results from a study sequencing DNA from remains that were 430,000 years old. What that study showed is that Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens were interbreeding. So in fact, we were getting it on with Neanderthals many hundreds of thousand years ago. And some of those genes have survived and are found in our own genetic makeup. How do we know this? Well, more than a decade ago, scientists took on the tremendous task of mapping the entire human genome as part of something called the Human Genome Project. So now we know, at least for some populations, what all the genes of modern humans look like in terms of sequence. We can compare now that genome to the genome of other species. And by doing this, we can tell how many of these genes were in common, how many of them have changed a little bit or a lot since these early ancestors, and how many of those have remained the same and are still part of our modern Homo sapiens genome. So in fact, not only were there more than one species of humans at a particular time, but those were actually interbreeding. Also note that different species of Homo coexisted in the same area, whereas others evolved in other areas allopatrically probably, and did not interbreed with each other, as is probably the case of Homo floresiensis versus Homo sapiens, for example. So what makes a human from the biological standpoint? There are a number of traits that we already talked about that we have in common with other species, but what are the things that separate Homo sapiens from other species? In other words, this is not what we call synapomorphies. These are a group of traits that we call autapomorphies, or uniquely derived characters. So what characters distinguish humans from other apes? Number one, the upright posture and bipedal, meaning in 2 feet, locomotion that happens all the time. Apes may be able of bipedal locomotion, but that is not their natural state. The larger brains, of course, we have a larger brain capacity than any other ape. The language capabilities that we have are far more sophisticated because they include also, they are rooted in symbolic thought. We have the ability to think in terms of abstractions and manifest those abstractions through writing and language. We manufacture far more complex tools than any other species. Many species use tools and many can even make them. That includes even birds. But we can make more complex tools than any other species known. We have a much shorter jaw than any other species of ape. This is actually a very good opportunity to show how genes and evolution tie together into determining how traits of different species evolve. This is an animation showing you the skull of a baby chimpanzee, actually a fetus of a chimpanzee and a fetus of a human. What you see is that we are almost identical in our genomes by 98%, but there have been mutations that control the development of the bones in the skull that have changed how much the bones of the skull develop, particularly the jaw bones. So in a chimpanzee, the bones that regulate growth of the skull would lead to the formation of very long jaws like that. Whereas in a human, some of the bones that you find in this part of the face do not elongate as much because certain gene mutations have led to a formation of a skull that does not continue growing in this lower part. So these mutations have led to a different skull shape. In a sense, and this is what is explained here in the caption, we retain a more juvenile looking type of skull. This is a developmental process and we're not going to talk about this in any detail, but it is one of the many ways in which different species evolve to look different from a common ancestor. But going back to the traits that make humans humans, the last one is that we have a shorter digestive tract than other hominids. And this is related to the fact that at one point we evolved to be hunters and we started including more meat in our diet than other species of hominids. If you compare our diet to the diet of other apes, you see that most other apes are largely vegetarians, whereas humans are more omnivorous. So we started including more meat in our diet, and the consequence of that is that you don't need as much of an effort to extract nutrients from animal flesh than you do from plant material. So evolutionarily, it's advantageous to have shorter digestive tracts if you have a carnivorous diet, because animal matter it's easier to break down with the digestive enzymes that we have, and it is easier to absorb those nutrients once that material is broken down than it would be if we had a diet that is mostly plant matter. So the switch from vegetarians to more carnivorous, or at least more omnivorous diets, meaning that we eat both, caused a shift that was enough of a selective pressure to evolve a shorter digestive system to extract nutrients. There is a second consequence from this incorporation of animal matter into our diets. And now recent studies have shown that the increase in brain capacity, and particularly the evolution of certain parts of the brain, would have not been possible if we had not begun incorporating animal matter into our diets. So the fact is, we evolved larger brains, at least in part, because we became more carnivorous. But as you know from this class, nothing is ever as simple and as straightforward as that. There were mutations involved here. So for example, we also know that there is a gene called FOXP2 that is essential for the development of human language. And that particular gene, by comparing it to the same equivalent gene in other species, we know that it has been under intense natural selection ever since the human lineage, at least for the modern humans, about 200,000 years ago, began. So the gene mutated, but the fuel that allowed that gene to operate and lead to larger brains was actually related to a shift in diet as well. So Homo sapiens, like you and me, are the only species that has evolved on Earth, as far as we know, that is capable of symbolic thought and more complex, sophisticated thought than previously seen in any other groups. And this is related to mutations and shifts in our diet that led to the evolution of larger brains. With this, we finish our history of human evolution, and we will focus now on the effects of humans as a dominant species on the biosphere for the rest of the class. I will see you next time.